Doreen.
Hi everybody, welcome to you all. We have one apology actually, which is from Valerie Herman, which I think we should note down. David's talk this afternoon is called My Great Grandmother's Journey from Amsterdam to Sunderland via London, Stroud and Manchester. Now, David was born into the Sunderland Jewish community in 1956, and following university and a few years living in Israel, has lived in Leeds since 1984 with his wife, where they raise their grown-up children now. He is a keen amateur genealogist with a particular interest in his maternal Spanish, Portuguese and Dutch ancestry, which has put him in touch with long-lost cousins all around the world. He is the administrator of the Sunderland Jewish Facebook group, which has over 350 members, and recently gave a very well-received Zoom talk for Milim on the long-lost Jewish communities of North East England. So without any more talking, I'd like now to introduce you to our speaker this afternoon, David Myer Gordon. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can do it right. All right, so hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint presentation.
Yep, looking good.
All right, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Doreen and Lee, for inviting me to give this talk about my journey into my family history, specifically my maternal great-grandmother's story. As Doreen says, I don't make any special claim to expertise as regards family history research. I'm not a professional genealogist, but I am probably, a bit like many of you, an enthusiastic amateur. Yes, I was born in 1956 in Sunderland, and I think it would be fair to say until about 2005, at which time I was already nearly 50, I had really rather little interest in genealogy. I very much regret not being more interested when I was younger, at a time when my grandparents were still alive and might have been able to give me some first-hand information. Having said that, my experience is that just as 30 years of age is old for a professional footballer, 50 is young for a family historian. It's just one of those things. So in 2005, I caught the genealogy bug. And as you know, what that leads to, it leads to long hours at the computer screen, internet chats with long-lost 5th to 8th cousins on other continents. It involves visits to burial grounds to photograph headstones, and it involves the mockery and derision of largely disinterested children of my own who think that we have enough relatives as it is without digging up more. So there was a time in 2005 when I noticed that Ancestry was offering a weekend of free access to their UK records, and I thought, well, this might be interesting. What was there to lose? I grew up in Sunderland on the chilly, fog-bound coast of northeast England, into a traditional Orthodox Jewish family with the surname Gordon. My father had been born in Sunderland, and his father, Isaac Gordon, had arrived in Sunderland without his parents, I think they were both dead, in about 1908 from Kovna in Lithuania. And there was a similar story on my mother's side, where at first sight, the family all appeared to be Litvaks. Nearly all of the Sunderland Jewish community originated from Lithuania, a sizable proportion of the families hailing from a single village, namely Kretinga, also known as Kretingen. I considered myself a Litvak through and through. There was some story about my mother's mother's mother, my great-grandmother, being Dutch, but I hadn't given that very much thought. So who should I search for on Ancestry now that I had some spare time and a weekend of free access to their records? Well, I knew that my mother's father, married to the Dutch great-grandmother, was called Adolf Cohn. And I didn't think there would be all that many Adolf Cohns, Adolf being a name which had somewhat fallen out of fashion amongst Jewish families in the early part of the 20th century for reasons which call for no explanation. I put Adolf Cohn into the search box on Ancestry, clicked enter. Because one of the joys of family history research is that it challenges your preconceived notions of who you are, where you came from. And what came up in my search results was the marriage of my mother's father, Adolf Cohn, to my great-grandmother, Rebecca. That's the Dutch great-grandmother. What took me by surprise was the location. Wait a minute, wasn't I from Sunderland? Wasn't all my family from Sunderland, and before that from Lithuania? It turned out that my maternal great-grandparents had been married in Cheltenham in 1878. Why Cheltenham? Isn't that in the countryside, far away from the main centres of Jewish population? Surely this was some kind of mistake. So I obtained a copy of the marriage certificate. I discovered that they were married in the synagogue in Cheltenham, and that my great-grandmother, the Dutch one, rejoiced in the maiden surname Rebecca Ribeiro, which I understand actually should be pronounced Ribeiro, but I'll pronounce it Ribeiro for purposes of this talk. That didn't sound all that Dutch to me, nor was it Litvak, certainly. The marriage certificate also told me that both the groom and the bride, Adolf and Rebecca, were living at the time that they were married, actually not in Cheltenham, but in nearby Stroud. So the plot thickened. Isn't it, ladies and gentlemen, actually your experience that once you start pulling at a genealogical family history thread in this way, you just have to keep pulling and pulling until the whole story eventually unravels? And so it was with me, and it connected me ultimately, as you're going to see, with a whole line of descent, which took me not back to Lithuania, but actually back to Stroud, to London, before that to Amsterdam, and before that to Lisbon, and even before that to Spain of the expulsion of 1492 and the Inquisition which followed. I did an internet search on Google for Adolf Cohn in Stroud. So I put in Adolf Cohn Stroud, and up popped a beautifully well-researched article from the 1970s by Harold Pollins on the short-lived Jewish community of Stroud in Gloucestershire, never more than a few hundred souls in that community. The article by Harold Pollins pointed me in the direction of several newspaper articles in the local Stroud newspapers from around 1877, 1878, which featured in particular Isidore Greenswag, who was frequently before the local courts of law, in relation to monetary disputes with other Jewish tailors. And a man called Adolf Cohn had, on at least one occasion, appeared as a witness in court to vouch for the doubtful honesty of Isidore Greenswag, who was described as being his brother-in-law. So surely, I thought, this Adolf Cohn must be my great-grandfather, married in Cheltenham in 1878 to the Dutch great-grandmother with the Spanish-sounding name. And so it proved. On further investigation, it seems that a local non-Jewish firm of clothing manufacturers, Holloway Brothers of Stroud, were pioneers of the ready-made clothing revolution, which was just taking off in the 1870s. In 1853, the firm purchased 13 sewing machines patented by C.T. Judkins of Manchester. The following year, they claimed to be the first company in the country to use a steam engine to power sewing machines. And they then went on to use revolutionary Singer sewing machines in their factories. Singer sewing machines invented by Isaac Singer in America in about 1850. The first factory outside America was built in Glasgow, Scotland, of course, in 1867. And in 1870, Singer sold 170,000 machines and opened its first factory in England. And Mr. George Holloway, whose statue still stands prominently in Stroud, Gloucestershire, he was also the local MP, recruited Isidore Greenswag, a master tailor from London, to work for him. And in an unusual development for a non-Jewish businessman, he encouraged Greenswag to recruit other highly skilled Jewish tailors to join him in Stroud from London and indeed from elsewhere. Leicester, for example, is mentioned. This was the beginning of the Little Stroud Jewish community in about 1877. I think we can be quite precise that that is when the community started. It's a community which thrived initially, but only lasted until about 1910, by which time it really was on its knees and it dissolved and disappeared thereafter. The sudden appearance of these Jewish tailors in Stroud in Gloucestershire didn't go unnoticed or unremarked. The Stroud Journal of the 8th of February, 1879 included a report of a court case, one of many, in which Jewish tailors claimed to have been induced to come to Stroud by the master tailor, Isidore Greenswag, who promised to pay them increased wages, an extra sixpence or a shilling or whatever it was, and he promised to pay for the costs of their removal, the cost of transfer from wherever they'd been living. When they had already uprooted their families and moved to Stroud, they often found Isidore Greenswag, a bit of a villain, you might say, wasn't quite so forthcoming with the extra pay, and they felt cheated, and they took Isidore Greenswag to court. A local magistrate remarked about this time that he, quote, hoped there was an end to these cases among the Jews. They had had more strife since this colony of tailors came to the town than they had amongst all the other inhabitants in the borough of Stroud. They seemed to lead a cat and dog life. He feared it would take the whole of a magistrate's time to dispose of all their trivial cases. In the local press, there were what were described as venomous, I suppose you'd say anti-Semitic, attacks on this tiny enclave of Jewish tailors, which had suddenly appeared in this sleepy West Country town. It seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that to his great credit, Mr. George Holloway, the local MP and the owner of Holloway Brothers, I think with his brother, by whom most of the Jews were employed, directly or indirectly, came to their defense in a letter of his own to the newspaper. And you can see the slide. He wrote to the newspaper as follows. It is quite true that we are engaging some work people from London. And although we haven't inquired as to the fact, it's very likely that some of them profess the Jewish faith. But as we never allow bigotry to influence our business transactions, their religious convictions are no concern of ours. We believe them to be honest, as we have employed them for some time past in London, and that, with the quality of their work, is all we are justified in inquiring about. Perhaps it's not generally known in Stroud that many thousands of the best tailors in London are Jews, and every wholesale and retail clothing firm of any importance employs them without let or hindrance, and we would ask, why should our firm be singled out? I dug deeper, and cutting a long story short, I discovered that my great-grandfather, that's Adolf Cohn, was indeed the brother-in-law of the Greenswag brothers, because the Greenswag boys, Isidore and Elias, Isidore being Mr. Holloway's right-hand man, were married to two sisters of my great-grandmother, Rebecca Ribeiro. And indeed, there was a fourth sister in Stroud, another Ribeiro girl who was married to another tailor, this one called Louis Sperling. So it turned out that a substantial part of this embryonic tiny community in Stroud comprised four Ribeiro sisters, including my great-grandmother. She was married to Adolf Cohn. Two of her sisters were married to the Greenswag boys, and another was married to a man called Sperling. And all four couples worked in one way or another for Holloway brothers. So naturally, I Googled the name Greenswag. Again, quite a distinctive name, not a Jewish name, obviously, but not a very common one. I Googled Greenswag, and that put me in contact with a long-lost second cousin of my mother called Sheila Harrison. She was actually a granddaughter of this somewhat disreputable, roguish Isidore Greenswag. And I was also put in touch with her niece, Wendy, both of whom, both Sheila and Wendy, had actually grown up in Stroud. They were somewhat far removed from their Jewish roots, you might say, albeit they were aware of them and were quite proud of their Jewish roots. These newfound cousins were very helpful in my research. They were able to point me in the direction of the relevant census entries. There in the 1881 census were my great-grandparents, newly married, living in Stroud with their still young children, David, Michael and Jacob, my mother's uncles, all of them born in Stroud. My mother, who is still alive, she's 94, remembered her uncles well, but had no idea that they'd been born in Stroud, or indeed that the family had any connection to Stroud. Hopefully you can see the entry here. There's Adolf Cohn there. He gives his place of birth as Germany, Posen. There's Rebecca Ribeiro, his wife, born in Holland, specifically Amsterdam, and they're the boys, David and Michael actually on here, born in Stroud. The Alec actually is Adolf's brother, who was also living with them at the time. By chance, my daughter was studying in Cheltenham at the time that I'm talking about, and my wife and I visited her and took the opportunity of visiting nearby Stroud as well. We visited the street where my great-grandparents had lived and also stood outside what had been the synagogue in Lansdowne Road. We knocked on the door of what is now a private home and were welcomed in by the occupant rather than the police being called. We were welcomed in by the occupant who knew all about the history of the building and was able to show us where the Ark had been, where the Hebrew school, the Cheder for the children, had been located at the back of the house, and where the women's gallery had been situated. And a number plate on the front of the building, I can indicate that here. Yeah, there's the number plate there. The number plate on the front of the building proudly displayed a Star of David, a Magen David, a poignant reminder of the building's history. Of course, when you do family history research, you begin to realize that who you thought you were may not be exactly the full picture. And that, of course, is one of the joys of genealogy. It just challenges your preconceptions. So far, I had discovered that my family wasn't simply from Sunderland and before that Lithuania, but they'd also had history in Stroud in Gloucestershire, of all places. But what about that name, Rebecca Ribeiro? That didn't sound Dutch. Where had my great-grandmother, supposedly the Dutch one, been before she moved to Stroud and married my great-grandfather in Cheltenham? And what was her history? My newfound cousins, Sheila and Wendy, the Greenswag descendants, the descendants of Isidore, the rogue, my great-grandmother's brother-in-law, were able to help with that. They pointed me in the direction of the 1871 census for London's East End, and specifically what appears to be a hostel or certainly a multi-occupancy boarding house at number 50 Lehman Street. It's near the Commercial Road in Whitechapel. Been there, although it's all, the original building is long gone. Here was my great-grandmother Rebecca living as a young woman with her parents. The entry is down here, actually. That's at the bottom. You can just about perhaps see David. It actually says David Leitcham, his wife Rachel, their daughter Rose, and in a moment I'll show you the second page, which is over the page. So here was my great-grandmother Rebecca. She was a young woman at the time. She was living with her parents and siblings, albeit, as I've just said, the enumerator, perhaps not understanding their foreign accents, made a complete mess of their surname, spelling Ribeiro variously as Leitcham and Livebay. Isidore Greenswag, by the way, was boarding in 1871 a few doors away at number 55 Lehman Street. And that's no doubt how the Greenswag brothers got to know the Ribeiro girls, who they went on to marry. So this slide is just the second page or the next page in the census. And at the top, we can see the surname there is not Ribeiro, but Livebay. But the first names exactly tally with what I knew about my great-grandmother's siblings. There she is, Rebecca, there, born, as we can see, in Holland, Amsterdam, and interestingly, Elias, her kid brother, a cigar maker, also born in Amsterdam. As far as Rebecca is concerned, and indeed all her siblings, she is down there as a tailoress. So what we see here is, again, the 1871 census, my great-grandmother Rebecca, her younger, still unmarried siblings. And as far as Elias is concerned, if you just keep him in mind, just remember that name, because I'm going to come back to Elias a little later in this talk. The 1871 census told me that my great-grandmother did indeed come from Holland, as we can see. And further investigation established that she, her parents and siblings appeared in a kind of census of Jewish inhabitants of Amsterdam carried out in, I think, in or about 1851. It might have been 1852. She was born in 1851, my great-grandmother. The family name was Nunes Ribeiro. Again, I'm told this should be pronounced Nunes Ribeiro. And the Nunes had later, more often than not, been dropped in official records, and they simply became Ribeiro. There she was, living in Neue Kerkstraat, New Church Street, translation, in Amsterdam, with her father, David. I can point to them. There's David there at the top. David, Rachel. Next down is Sarah, Clara or Claracha, Hannah, Emmanuel, Deborah, who is also known as Flora in other records, Miriam, Judith, there's my great-grandmother, Rebecca, and her youngest sibling here, Elias. So this is a scan of the actual book from, I think, the Municipal Archives in Amsterdam. It was available online, and actually I only discovered it yesterday. It was one of those wonderful eureka moments. Discovered it yesterday about 11:30 at night. So I was really thrilled, actually, to find that. I've seen a transcription of it before, but never the original. Further research suggested that the family, in common with many members of the Spanish-Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, had emigrated in the 1850s. Their eldest daughter, that's Sarah, who we can see here towards the top, was married to Joseph Barzilai at the Bevis Marks Spanish-Portuguese Shul synagogue in London's East End in the early 1860s, I think 1861. And it seems unlikely to me that she would have emigrated without her parents. So I expect the Nunes Ribeiro family emigrated from Amsterdam to London either sometime in the late 1850s or early 1860s. So just taking stock, now I knew that my family were not all, as it were, relative newcomers to Britain, arriving in the late 19th and early 20th century to England. But actually, they'd already been established, they were Victorians. They'd already been established in London when Queen Victoria was still a young woman, and Dickens was at the height of his literary powers. As far as Neue Kerkstraat, New Church Street in Amsterdam is concerned, forget, ladies and gentlemen, picturesque, touristy Amsterdam with its flower markets and quaint bridges and canals and interesting cafes, and think more East End of London in early Victorian times. This street, Neue Kerkstraat, was also known as Portuguese Street, Jew Church Street, and Shul Street, for obvious reasons. Conditions, I've learned, were insanitary. There had in fact been an outbreak of cholera in 1849, and infant mortality rates were high. It was a street inhabited by mostly very poor but pious Jews who were scraping a bare living and living cheek by jowl in poverty. I suppose you need to think Whitechapel and the Mile End Road rather than Stanmore and Bushey. People don't emigrate, let's face it, from one country to another on a whim. Holland had been top nation in the world in the 17th century for a short period, but its empire, based on maritime trade, especially in the Far East and the Caribbean, was short-lived. And it had been, over the decades and centuries which followed, out-muscled and eclipsed economically by Britain, certainly by the mid-19th century. And it was natural for the Nunes Ribeiro family and many other families like them to wish to better themselves by exchanging Amsterdam for London. And that's clearly what my mother's ancestors did. The records of the Amsterdam Municipal Archives are very helpful, and they're largely intact. The Nazis' reverence for bureaucracy and paperwork no doubt allowed their, that's to say, the archives' survival, while at the same time, the Nazis organized the murder of the Jewish population of Amsterdam with ruthless efficiency. But they left the paperwork behind, for which we're grateful. I've been able to trace my Nunes Ribeiro roots back many generations in Amsterdam into the 18th century, when my direct ancestors seem to have escaped the Iberian Peninsula, in their case, Lisbon, and emigrated to the religious freedoms afforded by the Netherlands. My great-grandmother Rebecca's father, as you can see on this slide, was David Nunes Ribeiro. His father was Emmanuel Nunes Ribeiro, born in Amsterdam in 1777. His father was another David Nunes Ribeiro. The names are constantly recycled and recirculated. He had been born in Lisbon in 1742, and his father, who was Abraham Nunes Ribeiro, was born in Lisbon in 1684, dying and being buried in Amsterdam in 1776. So I had naively thought that my family had all been in the UK by the time Hitler came to power. And very naively, I thought that my family, the Gordons in Sunderland, had escaped the worst ravages of the Holocaust. When I looked into it more closely, that turned out to be only partly true as regards the Nunes Ribeiro family. Just on this slide, if you keep in mind David Nunes Ribeiro, that's the the father of my great-grandmother, Rebecca. My research into the Nunes Ribeiro family gave me a wholly different perspective on the Holocaust, and frankly, a real sense of how lucky I and my family are to be alive today. If David Nunes Ribeiro and his wife, Rachel DeVos, so Rebecca's, my great-grandmother's parents, if they had not decided to leave Holland for England in the 1850s or 1860s, things might have been very different. And I can say that because the brother of my great-grandfather, David Nunes Ribeiro, he was called Michael Nunes Ribeiro. He did emigrate to London, but he didn't stick it out. Michael went back to Amsterdam together with most of his family, and they there in Amsterdam raised their family, their children and grandchildren, and they were there when war broke out in 1939. And when I built up, as it were, in Ancestry, this branch of the family, it became very quickly apparent to me that, in common with a very high proportion of the Jewish inhabitants of the Netherlands, many ended up in Sobibor and Auschwitz death camps, where their fates, of course, were sealed. Although they were those who were murdered in the camps, they were my grandmother's second cousins. My family seemed to have been sublimely unaware of their existence, let alone their fate. Some years ago, my daughter Rachel, there she is, and I went on she won't thank me for the photograph, I don't think. Some years ago, my daughter Rachel and I went on a father-daughter trip to Amsterdam, and we visited the SIG, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam's Jewish quarter. It's a stone's throw from Nieuwe Kerkstraat, New Church Street, where my great-grandmother had been born. This is the magnificent synagogue where my great-grandparents, David Nunes Ribeiro and Rachel DeVos, were married in 1836. I'd like to think that the heavy wooden chuppah, marriage canopy, situated in the synagogue is the original 19th century chuppah under which my great-great-grandparents stood on their wedding day, close to 200 years ago, but it is perhaps of more recent manufacture. If you're in Amsterdam and haven't before visited the SIG, I would recommend it. It's the prototype for the Bevis Marks synagogue in London. When Jews were readmitted in the 17th century to England by Oliver Cromwell following the expulsion of 1290, the new arrivals from Holland wanted to pray in familiar surroundings, and so they built themselves in Creechurch Lane a slightly scaled down version of their synagogue in Amsterdam. Most of the first arrivals were, of course, Spanish Portuguese Jews. Let's go back to Stroud for a moment. My great-grandmother, having married in 1878, gave birth to all three of her sons in Stroud. My mother's uncles, David, Michael, and Jacob, also known as Jack. But Rebecca Cohn, born Rebecca Nunes Ribeiro, then went on to have two daughters, Rosie, and then her youngest child, my grandmother, Florrie. And both of them were, in fact, born in Lancashire. Rosie was born in Newton Heath, which I think is part of Manchester. I hope I don't do the place a disservice in saying that. And my grandmother was actually born just outside Manchester in Oldham in 1890. Clearly, the family stayed in Stroud for no more than 13 years, and probably less than that. Indeed, the 1891 census shows Adolf Cohn and his wife Rebecca living in Granton Street in Cheetham Hill, an area of Manchester which then had a large immigrant Jewish population, centre of the rag trade. And one of the inhabitants was somebody called Michael Marks. He and a man called Thomas Spencer, not a Jewish man, opened the first Marks and Spencer store on Cheetham Hill Road in 1893, which I can only say must have been convenient for my great-grandparents, particularly if they were running short of avocados or needed a bottle of Chablis. In the 1891 census, this is it here. Here they are. There's Adolf there. There's Rebecca, David, Michael, Jacob, Rose, and Florrie. They're all there. Here, Adolf actually gives his place of birth as Prussia, and I think that says Wagrowicz, which is a place now in Poland, but it was Wągrowiec, which was in Prussia at the time. That's going to be my next line of inquiry. Anyway, this is the 1891 census, which is on this slide. And I find it quite interesting, apart from the fact that I learned that he was born in Wagrowicz. We can also see that when he was asked his occupation, he told the enumerator, it's here, right there. He told the enumerator that he was an agent, superintendent over men selling sewing machines. He'd come up in the world since he came to England and worked with his brother-in-law as a lowly tailor in Stroud, and clearly he wanted the enumerator to know that he was no Nebuchadnezzar. He was a superintendent over other men, salesmen. The stay in Manchester, like the stays in London and Stroud, seems to have been short-lived, certainly no more than 10 years, because by the time of the 1901 census, the family were living in Sunderland. This in itself was interesting to me because in my own lifetime, the direction of migration has been nearly all in the opposite direction, with scores, if not indeed hundreds, of Jewish people leaving Sunderland to go and live elsewhere, including in Manchester throughout the late 20th century, so much so that the Sunderland Jewish community ceased to exist in 2006. Why then did my great-grandparents leave Manchester to go to Sunderland? Seemed to me to be the wrong direction. But I've learned in doing my research, family history research, to keep a historical perspective, and I've tried to have some understanding of what was going on in the world in which my ancestors lived. I learned that it's a mistake to think of their world in 21st century terms. I'd seen that already in relation to Amsterdam and its 19th century poverty-stricken Jewish quarter, which in no way resembled the area as it appears to tourists today. However depressed economically Sunderland had been, or has been in the last 50 years, and especially since the closure of the coal mines and the shipyards in the 1980s, Sunderland was a boom town at the end of the 19th century, turning out ships by the dozen to facilitate trade with Britain's ever-expanding empire and shipping coal down the coast to London in special boats called colliers to keep the capital's population warm and to supply power to the factories and workshops in the capital, which at that time produced consumer goods for the United Kingdom and for its vast empire, the largest and most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Even when I was born in 1956, Sunderland was still one of the biggest, if not the biggest, shipbuilding town in the world by tonnage, employing thousands of people in the shipyards and ancillary trades such as tailoring and furniture manufacture. My ancestors and indeed many other Jewish people migrated to Sunderland, not because they wanted to impoverish themselves, but because they saw Sunderland as a place of new economic opportunities for themselves and for their children. Sunderland was a boom town, thriving economically. It had a small but well-established, closely knit Jewish community, the oldest Jewish community in the northeast of England, even older than Newcastle. And this attracted for a while Jewish immigration, even from such places as Manchester and London, which is a rather startling notion to us in 2021. The family were well established in Sunderland by the time of the 1911 census, although my great-grandfather Adolf seems to have left behind the tailoring trade and his agency for Singer sewing machines. And when filling out the form, of course, the 1911 census was the first census to be filled in by the householders themselves rather than semi-literate enumerators. My great-grandfather declared that he was a furniture dealer, a common and potentially lucrative occupation amongst the Jews of Sunderland at the time, although I don't get the impression that my great-grandparents ever made any significant sums of money at all. A family photograph taken in about 1900, maybe a little bit earlier, suggests that the family thrived in Sunderland. I'm not so sure about that. It's obviously a posed photograph. Certainly, I think they wanted to project the fact that they were established, they were respectable in their new hometown. Here we have Rebecca Nunes Ribeiro and her husband Adolf Cohn at the back standing. We have David with Jacob, known to my mother as Uncle Jack, seated in front of him. On the right at the back standing, we have Michael. Between her parents, there's my great auntie Rosie, and the little girl with her hand on her dad's knee on the right of the photo is my grandmother, Florrie, who only died in 1978 and who I remember well. She would keep me well supplied with Bourneville chocolate when she came to my parents' house for supper twice a week. She played the piano at the silent movies when she was young. She worked in a fashion shop, well-known fashion shop in Sunderland, books. She walked everywhere. She loved the seafront in Sunderland, where she was to be found most days in the summer months. And she had a talent for elaborate crochet work, some of which we have inherited. In Stroud, my great-grandmother Rebecca had 3 of her sisters living close by with their husbands, but in Sunderland, she was alone as far as the Ribeiros were concerned. I was interested in what happened to her siblings, where their offspring ended up in the world, and I wondered if they knew anything of us, their Sunderland cousins. Certainly their Sunderland cousins, my mother and her mother, seemed to know nothing about them. Her elder sister, Sarah, had married Joseph Barzilai in London, and both of them, Sarah and Joseph, ended their days never having children. They ended up in the home for aged Spanish Portuguese Jews in the Mile End Road in London. The next elder sister, Clara, married a man called Emmanuel Barzilai in Amsterdam, and they emigrated, it seems to me, directly to America without ever going to London. I found one of her descendants, Rachel Barzilai, living today in Florida. I had some contact with her, and DNA testing confirmed that we are indeed third cousins once removed. The next eldest sister, Hannah, married Henry Hertz and lived and died in London. I've traced a number of their descendants to Toronto in Canada. Her eldest brother, Emmanuel, married Mina von Straten and had many children, one of whom I had the pleasure of meeting some years ago, a keen genealogist who was unaware of my branch of the family. Flora married Elias Greenswag, and Miriam, also known as Jane, married Isidore Greenswag, while Judith, also known as Julia, married Louis Sperling. I've traced and in some instances met their descendants. They are what might be called the Stroud sisters, together with my great-grandmother Rebecca. Rebecca's only younger sibling, the one I asked you to keep in mind when we looked at an earlier slide, Rebecca's only younger sibling, Elias Nunes Ribeiro, lived all his life in London and was married to Betsy Brandon Bravo. You may remember him in the 1871 census, as I say. Did my great-grandmother Rebecca Nunes Ribeiro stay in contact with her Spanish Portuguese sisters and brothers after she moved to the northeast of England? It's a long way north, and it wasn't clear to me what, if any, contact she maintained with her wider family. This brings me on to my next discovery in the family history. The social and personal columns of the Jewish Chronicle are available to view if you subscribe, and they make fascinating reading. Just as I'd started my voyage of discovery by searching in Ancestry for what I considered a distinctive name, Adolf Cohn, once I'd become aware of my Nunes Ribeiro ancestry, it seemed only sensible to search the Jewish Chronicle archives for that even more unusual name. In the edition of the 19th of September, 1884, I found the announcement of the death of my great-great-grandmother, Rachel Nunes Ribeiro, apparently called Rose or Rosie. She died and was buried at the St. Philip Jewish Cemetery in Bristol. No doubt she was living at the time with one of her children. There is a record of her death in the burial register of the Bristol Synagogue. Her husband, my great-grandfather David Nunes Ribeiro, had died in London much earlier, in August 1873, and he was buried at the Nuevo Jewish Cemetery in the Mile End Road. He was already dead by the time my great-grandmother married Adolf Cohn in Cheltenham in 1878. In 1916, in the middle of World War I, the Great War so-called, there was announced in the Jewish Chronicle the engagement of Rosie Cohn of Amberley Street in Sunderland to Michael Ribeiro of the Australian forces, as you can see on this slide. This gives rise, or gave rise, to so many questions. Who was Michael Ribeiro? How could Rosie, obviously my great aunt, my grandma's sister, how could she marry a Ribeiro when her own mother was a Ribeiro? Why would a Ribeiro be in the Australian army? How could this be at all when, as far as I knew, my great aunt Rosie didn't marry anyone called Michael? She married a Jewish man from Newcastle called Alfred Jenkins, much older than she was, a widower. She lived much of her life in Brighton, and she died in the Jewish old age home in Sunderland, to the best of my knowledge. This all sent me into full Sherlock Holmes mode. Well, I think we've all been there, late nights, trawling the internet, hoping for that eureka moment of discovery. In the morning, we're all bursting to tell our nearest and dearest of our startling discovery, but they just shrug their shoulders, don't they? I Googled Michael Ribeiro and Australia in a single search, and this took me to the Australian National Archives, where without any difficulty, I was able to access quite detailed military records from the First World War, 1914 to 1918, during which the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand forces, came into existence for the first time as an independent national fighting force, distinguishing themselves first at Gallipoli. Even if it was a disaster, they distinguished themselves in terms of their fighting ability, and then on the Western Front, and indeed in Palestine, where the Australian Light Horse fought the famous and crucial Battle of Beersheba under the command of General Allenby, the last step before the liberation of Jerusalem from the Turks. This photo shows Michael Ribeiro on leave in England at a family wedding in his Australian Army uniform. He fought with the 4th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Forces. It transpired that Michael Ribeiro, who was a ship's steward by occupation, at the outbreak of war in 1914, just happened to be on a merchant ship anchored in Sydney Harbour. He was the son of Elias and Betsy Nunes Ribeiro. I knew from my research that Elias was the younger brother of my great-grandmother Rebecca, as we've seen. So the announcement of the engagement in the Jewish Chronicle represent the engagement of first cousins to each other. One a Londoner, Michael, and the bride-to-be from Sunderland, Rosie. Clearly, Rebecca was indeed, even while in Sunderland, in close contact with her brother Elias in London, long before emails, long before FaceTime, and even before telephones were common in houses. I was able to read in Michael's records that he'd immediately in 1914 done his patriotic duty. He volunteered for service in the Australian Imperial Forces. He was sent to Egypt for training, and then after that to fight on the Western Front. He was wounded on a number of occasions, sent to hospitals to recuperate in England on more than one occasion, and then sent back to the Western Front. And it must have been on one of those hospitalizations or visits to England that his parents had made the marriage match, made the shidduch, with his sister's daughter, Rosie, my great aunt. But it still didn't make sense. Where was the record of their marriage? Who were their children? Who were their descendants? I read on in the documents from the Australian archives and discovered that not so long before the end of the war, the 16th of April, 2018, at the Fourth Battle of Ypres, Wipers, Michael Ribeiro had been killed in action and buried in France. He never did marry Rosie. They never had children. She was a war widow before she was even married. And she went on to marry Alfred Jenkins, a man much older than her, and they never had children. A few years ago, my wife and I were in northern France. We went to visit Michael's grave in the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery at Utersteine. I'm not sure the grave had had many visitors since he was interred there. I said the mourner's prayer, placed a stone on his headstone where he lies with hundreds of his comrades in arms. Many Australians, many British soldiers brought in from the surrounding battlefields and given a decent burial and fitting memorial. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission keep the cemetery in pristine condition. So my grandmother's sister, Rosie, there she is on the right-hand side as we look at this photo, lost her fiance and first cousin Michael in the Great War. It must have been a terrible time because having announced the engagement in 1915, my great-grandmother Rebecca, born in Amsterdam in 1851, died in Sunderland in 1916. And within 18 months of Rosie losing her mother, her fiance was also dead. This photo, taken in about 1930, some 12 years later, shows Rosie on the right. My grandmother Florrie is in the center, so two, as it were, Ribeiro descendants there. And the little girl is my mother. Riva Rebecca is her middle name, named after the grandmother she never knew, Rebecca Cohn, born in Amsterdam as Rebecca Nunes Ribeiro. I discovered that Michael, killed in action in 1918, had a number of brothers and sisters. Sadly, he wasn't the only one to fight for king and country and pay the ultimate price. His brother Joseph, pictured here, known it would seem as Harry, fought in the First World War with the Royal Lancaster Regiment, British Army. He was killed on the Western Front on the 18th of July, 1917, 9 months before his brother Michael, and he too is buried in France. What a devastating blow that must have been for his parents, Elias and Betsy, who lived in London, and all the family. The whole family must have been devastated by these events. Rosie lost a fiance. Elias and Betsy lost 2 sons. I got in touch with a descendant of another brother of Michael and Joseph, so another child of Elias and Betsy, namely Emmanuel Ribeiro. This third cousin, to my surprise, lived in, and still lives, in Manchester, only 40 miles away from my home in Leeds, from where I'm talking to you. And she was the granddaughter of Emmanuel Ribeiro and great-granddaughter of Elias Ribeiro, my great-grandmother's brother. My long-lost third cousin in Manchester was able to tell me something about her grandfather, Emmanuel, or Manny, and the rest I was able to read in the archives. Emmanuel Ribeiro was a famous, at the time infamous, absolutist, conscientious objector. He refused to fight in World War I. He lived in Salford, Manchester. He was an engraver by profession. He was conscripted after conscription started in January 1916. Prior to that, service in the war had been voluntary. He was denied exemption from military service by a tribunal. Emmanuel Ribeiro was an absolutist. He refused to cooperate with conscription or even to do war work as an alternative, and he went on hunger strike, having been arrested and imprisoned. He maintained this for over a year, being force-fed no fewer than 155 times against his will in Warrington Prison and Wormwood Scrubs. His treatment led to articles appearing in national newspapers, and questions were asked of the Under-Secretary of State for War in the House of Commons by MPs, and a petition was got up and sent to Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. As we see from this exchange recorded in Hansard, the official record of the proceedings of Parliament, Philip Snowden, Labour MP for Blackburn, who was later to become the first ever Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924, was one of those who took up Emmanuel's plight and championed his cause. Snowden, although not a pacifist, campaigned against conscription in World War I. A transcript of a letter from Ribeiro himself to his wife from 1917 reads as follows. I wish you first to know what transpired up to 5 o'clock Wednesday. Tuesday morning, I resist with all my strength. Also Monday evening previous. On Tuesday afternoon, they change the method. They force a gag into my mouth, which causes terrible punishment. Then a tube was put in the mouth and forced into the stomach, with 6 men holding me down from moving. On Tuesday evening, I was out of bed. I resist, and after falling on the ground, they, with all hands holding me on the ground, forcibly fed me there. This, I say, is scandalous. It is not only inhuman, but barbarous torture of the worst kind. On Wednesday morning, I was gagged and forcibly fed with great pain. Also, when I've gone out of the room, I'm continually dragged back and thrown like a dog into the room, and the door is held for some time until I get into bed. June 1917, as I say, a petition for his immediate release and grant of absolute exemption from military service was submitted to the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, signed amongst others by George Lansbury, later leader of the Labour Party, also signed by the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell, and Lady Emily Lutyens, wife of Edwin Lutyens, who was in 1920 to design the cenotaph, which stands today in Whitehall. Eventually, Emmanuel Ribeiro was released from prison. He recovered his health, but his marriage never recovered. They were unable to take the strain in the long term. He, in fact, I'm told, abandoned his wife and children and later married out of the faith, becoming estranged from his children and grandchildren. He's buried in the Spanish-Portuguese cemetery in Manchester. So that, in brief, was the life of my great-grandmother Rebecca Nunes Ribeiro, born in Amsterdam in about 1851. She emigrated with her family to London in the late 1850s or early 1860s, and she married, as we've seen, in Cheltenham in 1878. She lived in Stroud in the 1880s, as did 3 of her married sisters. And upon leaving Stroud, the family moved to the Manchester area and was living in Cheetham Hill, Manchester, certainly by 1891. Having given birth to 3 sons in Stroud, she gave birth to 2 daughters in Lancashire, including my grandmother, Florrie. The family moved to Sunderland no later than 1901 and was seemingly well established and comfortably well off, although far from wealthy, by 1911. She kept contact with her Ribeiro relatives, as is clear from the engagement of her daughter, Rosie, to her nephew, Michael Ribeiro, son of Elias, in 1915. But she, Rebecca, died in 1916 in Sunderland, and she's buried in the Jewish cemetery in Sunderland, the Bishop Wearmouth Cemetery. Many years ago, I photographed all the headstones in that cemetery, including hers. And at that time, I didn't realize that this was my great-grandmother's grave. After all, Rebecca Cohn is hardly a distinctive name. My grandmother Florrie must have known of her Ribeiro family connection, as her sister Rosie was engaged to the ill-fated Michael Ribeiro, but my grandmother never passed down this information to my mother. I do visit Rebecca's grave, pictured here, from time to time, and have a quiet word with my great-grandmother. I put a stone on her grave, and I tell her that I've rediscovered her family, and I hope to keep alive, in some small way, her Spanish-Portuguese heritage. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my story. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Absolutely fascinating. And what a journey that your family made from Lisbon to Amsterdam, Sunderland, Manchester, and finally to Leeds. So it shows you how well travelled our families actually were, and what a vast aspect of people and countries it covers. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk.
My pleasure.
I'd like to throw it open now to questions from our members. So are there some questions, please, for David? Through the chair, please. Bernard, you have your hand up.
I do indeed. First of all, David, thank you so much for that. It was not just information packed, but it did give me a chance to establish that we are eighth cousins 3 times removed, and that our common ancestors are my 8th and your 7th, because you're younger than me, great-grandmother, Marian Miriam Sagman or Schachman, born in Hamburg in 1659.
Yeah.
And Jonas Jontov Gerson Cohen Klot, born in Amsterdam in 1653.
Yeah, we've got a cousin in California, Bernard, who I chat to from time to time, but have never met. Also a Kloot descendant.
Can I also say that at every generation on that side of the family, which is my mother's father's side, the descendant has married somebody on my mother's side. Mm-hmm. So the names come in, but they're not direct family. I'm fascinated. When we started, there was me thinking, oh, well, David Gordon, it's a common name. We won't be related. But I have a question which I was going to raise in the workshop, but it's probably just as good to bring it up here. A question was asked on Sephardic World on the Sephardic Heritage website earlier in the week about the Cigar Club. And I know from something that my mum said that a cousin of hers, who she referred to as Brommy Santon, had been president of the Tobacco Workers Union. It was originally the Cigar Makers Union. And I've been trying to track him down. I can't find anything with his name. If I look in the historical records of the Cigar Workers or the Tobacco Workers Union, I find an Alf Santon. And I'm guessing that Brommy probably means that he had the name Abraham, which had got contracted to Brommy, which is what he was known as. But they also had a cousin who went on to become president of the Tobacco Workers Union of America and the founder of the American Federation of Labor, which is the equivalent of the TUC. And I wondered whether you'd come across the Santon tobacco connection in your research, and whether or not you had any hints in that direction.
Bernard, I haven't. I will keep my eyes open. What I can say is that it's clear that the Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese immigrants to London were very much involved in the cigar making industry in London, which was big business, clearly, and employed hundreds, if not thousands of people. This was known, the cigar making, the tobacco industry, it was known as a Spanish-Portuguese trade, as it were. Yeah. And many of my Spanish-Portuguese ancestors were involved in London in the cigar trade. I suppose it links in a way to the Caribbean, maybe, I don't know. A lot of Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese Jews had close connections with the Caribbean. At one stage in Amsterdam, the municipality actually paid Spanish Portuguese Jews a sum of money if they would take themselves off to the Caribbean and promise to stay there for at least 10 years. They wanted to reduce the Spanish Portuguese Jewish population of Amsterdam. Many of them went to Curacao and other places
where I have a seventh
Sephardi communities. And so I think there may be a link there with tobacco and so on. Anyway, I'll keep my eye open for that particular name.
And we can keep in touch, because I've got a lot of interesting things. Can I just throw into the tobacco thing, the person who got me into genealogy, although I didn't know it at the time, with a throwaway comment that she made round about 1967-8, was somebody called Sally Musafia or Musafia. She was a cousin of my grandfather's, and I was very good friends with her. And she had always told me her story, which was common, was she had left school aged 12 to work in the cigarette factory.
Yeah.
And as a 12-year-old, they were paid either half or 3/4 of their salary in cigarettes. And so as a 12-year-old, she smoked, and she smoked until she was in her mid-70s, when suddenly one day she decided that this was wasting her money and stopped. And she still had dark hair, but she had a shock of white hair in the middle. And within 3 months, that shock of white hair had turned dark to match the rest. So it was probably being bleached by these cigarettes.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of tobacco and cigarette connections,
absolutely,
including the Caribbean. So thank you. And hello, cousin.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Absolutely fascinating. Adrian had a question about the family. Adrian, do you want to unmute and to ask the question yourself? Adrian Ross?
Okay, yes, I've unmuted. Yes. First of all, an extremely interesting and well put together talk. You didn't lose me 1 minute with jumping from one bit of the family to the other. I just wanted to ask, I had a great uncle called Sam Brown, who was a well-known singer, 1920s to 1940s. And he married a woman called Olga Osterman, who came from Sunderland. Have you heard of the family?
No, it doesn't ring bells with me. Osterman.
Yes.
Doesn't ring bells with me, but I can certainly do some research. I have access to some specifically Sunderland resources.
Okay.
A lot of people pass through Sunderland. Some spent, some settled down there, brought up their families. Some stayed only a short time before moving on elsewhere. It doesn't ring any bells with me. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I think that maybe after she married my uncle, she would have moved to London, and I think that her immediate family might have moved to London as well, because there's some talk. My great uncle's youngest sister is still alive, and she said, "Oh, all the family came down to sponge off Sam." So, I don't know if that's true, but so they might have left there.
Yeah.
I can't remember when he got married to Olga. I never met Olga, but I do know that Olga was his second wife, because the first wife died in not in childbirth, though she had some condition that was fatal during pregnancy. I think it might have been preeclampsia, but yeah. So anyway, thank you very much.
Not at all. Incidentally, we have here, I can see, and I'm going to say hello, quite a lot of Sunderland people who I recognize. Hello, Shirley Goodman. And we've got the DeCostas here. I don't know whether Susan's there. I can see quite a few Sunderland people. So it's very nice to see.
So you're among friends, David. That's the important thing. We have a question from John Perlman. John, would you like to unmute? John Perlman, would you like to unmute? Thank you.
I've done that. Yes, I've done that.
Right. Okay, you have a question?
Yeah, there's just something that happened. I was working down in Stevenage, the chap came from Newcastle.
Mhm.
He was his mother was Jewish. He
Yeah.
mentioned to me that the Pearlmans of Sunderland. Plus a couple
Yes.
of
Very, very big family, very prominent family with many branches, important business people in the Sunderland Jewish community, and their descendants don't live in Sunderland anymore, but they're very often to be found in London, in Manchester, in Israel. Very big family. Wherever you go in the world, you say, I'm from Sunderland. Do you know the Pearlmans? Is usually the first question that anybody asks.
There's three different.
They don't ask, do you know the Gordons? But they ask, do you know the Pearlmans?
Yeah, okay. Well, three different people have approached me, said, do you know anything about the Pearlmans of Sunderland?
So you may be connected, John. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. See, as far as I know,
It's spelt in the same way as your name.
That's right.
Yeah.
But my great grandparents came from Lithuania, went to London, and then they moved up to Leeds. Then they were in Manchester, and my great grandfather died and grandmother died in Manchester. So I have his name from naturalisation papers. His name was Hyman.
Yeah.
And his father before him was Samuel or Shmuel.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether, see, as far as I know.
Helps when there's something a bit more distinctive, like Reginald or something.
Yeah, I know. But as far as I know, I know of no brothers or sisters that he had.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. I just can't find any trace of them.
No.
So I'm assuming that if you go back one generation further, there may have been a brother who was his uncle or a cousin of his father or something that would.
Yes, and then the way that names were spelt varied. People dumped their names and took on new names. Pearlman is very often spelt without the A. So P-E-R, or spelt Perelman. So there are so many variations. It might be worth searching under one of the variations.
I've seen a birth certificate of a great aunt, and his name's there's a sort of an I between the L and the M, Perelman.
Yeah. Well, this is it.
And my grandfather was killed in the First World War. So on one of his military records is Perelman without the A.
Yeah.
And the second one is the Perelman with the A.
This is it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wondered. It seems I must have some family resemblance to somebody.
Right, I'm looking at you.
Thank you so much. It sounds as though you're quite famous in Sunderland to me.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I've know of no link. That's the thing. But I've had three people said to me, "Do you know anything about the Pearlmans of Sunderland?"
Yeah.
So there might be a little link there. I don't know.
You must keep looking because David is an example to us all. Judith has a question. Judith Silver.
So my connection to Sunderland is by marriage, the marriage of my my father's mother's sister, whom we knew as Auntie Addie, or Adel in Yiddish. Her maiden name is Adel Spearer, and she was married to Solomon Gillis. And I know that there were apparently two Gillis families in Sunderland, and there were a lot of them.
Yeah.
But I was really interested in your point about the being a house furnisher, because my great grandfather, the father of Auntie Addie Della Spira, his name is listed in three censuses, or at least two, 1891 and 1901, as a house furnisher, a master house furnisher. Now, in 1891, they just arrived from Galicia and they were in Liverpool. He was a house furnisher, and then they moved to Sheffield, and he was still a house furnisher. So I've always wondered about this, and was this a sort of Jewish trade or?
Judith, two things. Firstly, Gillis family, very prominent family. You're right. I think there were two different Gillis families.
Yeah, so I heard.
Maybe connected, possibly not connected, but prominent families, big families in Sunderland. The second part. When you think about it, Sunderland, shipbuilding, even after they stopped building ships of wood and started making them of metal, the shipbuilding industry required thousands of joiners because the ship's interiors were fitted out in wood. This is an age before plastic. And so a town like Sunderland, city as it is now, a town like Sunderland, there was a big spin-off from the shipbuilding industry. I mentioned clothing because, of course, everybody needs clothes, but another big spin-off was joinery. Thousands of joiners, woodworkers were employed in the shipyards. And when they weren't working in the shipyards, for one reason or another, they were making furniture. And so many of the wealthier Jewish people in Sunderland had their own furniture factories. There were many cabinet makers, and this was it was an important trade as far as the Jews of Sunderland were concerned. I'm talking about in the old days before they all became accountants, lawyers, and doctors.
Thank you. And may I also slip in that I was fascinated that you have looked at your great-grandparents' brothers and sisters and found things that you didn't expect, including the fact that some who stayed in Amsterdam didn't survive the Second World War. And I too have found this, I mean, it's a completely different context. It's Poland. And I just had a breakthrough about 3 weeks ago and found that the twin brother of my great grandfather I'd never been able to trace, and I found in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum a record for one of his sons and his family in the Lodz ghetto. So now I know what happened. And,
I know, I felt foolish. I felt that I'd been very naive in thinking, oh, well, you know, my family were already in England, you know, at the time of the war. We weren't, the Holocaust, dreadful, appalling, but didn't directly affect us. No, it was quite shocking in a way as an adult to discover that my grandmother's cousins, quite close cousins, you know, ended their days in Sobibor and Auschwitz and wherever else.
I think every Jewish family
has
such a story if we were to trace it.
Exactly. There is a sense in which we can regard ourselves all as survivors and very lucky to have escaped that fate.
But there was also the fact that it wasn't talked about.
No.
That all I mean, it was my great grandfather's twin brother.
Yeah.
Nobody, you know, there were letters between the wars.
Yeah.
After the Second World War, the letters stopped. Yeah. And that is all the information that had come down to me.
Yeah.
Didn't they ever wonder what had happened to their cousins?
Judith, I think they knew, but they didn't want to know.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they can't go into it anymore.
Yes.
And they've certainly never talked about it. But I think we all have to remember that much as we know about our own direct family, what about those that didn't leave?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much, Judith. We have a question from Leslie. Leslie, can you clear it so we can hear you? Leslie, Abdullah, you have a question? No, we can't hear you, Leslie.
Right, I've unmuted. Sorry. Every sentence nowadays must begin with "please unmute." Thank you very much, Chair. No, I was just, first of all, thank you, because I love the way you put it into lots of different interesting historic contexts. You know, the conscientious objector, Marks and Spencer, and so really made it colourful. Thank you. My family seemed to have followed yours, but next generation down, because my grandfather had a big shipbuilding business in Stroud on the ship canal there. Abdullah Mitchell was called, and went bust. Well, not when, I think they lost everything in the sort of just before Second World War. And they built things like stern wheelers for the Amazon and all sorts of things, boats to go down the Nile and things like that. They were broken up into pieces and sent through the canal to be shipped overseas. But they also had shipbuilding in Manchester because they were Sephardic Jews living in Cheetham Hill area, and is it Didsbury or Dewsbury? I'm not sure. But my question, if anyone knows, I haven't done genealogy like all of you, but I'm getting interested, is my grandfather died in the 1930s, so I never knew him. And I assume he was either buried in a synagogue in Manchester or in Blackpool, because I think he was sent there for the fresh air or something when he was ill towards the end. How could I find out? Is there anywhere that's easy to find out where he might be buried?
Leslie, can we come back to your question after?
Yes, of course.
We're going to have a tea, and we're going to have then go back to all the questions from our members.
I'm afraid I have to leave at 4 o'clock. Is it possible to sort of text me or?
Sorry, so we'll deal with it now in that case. So Leslie, can you repeat your question?
Yes. Is there anywhere that I can fairly easily, as a non-expert genealogist, find out where my grandfather might have been buried? I think it would be a synagogue in either Manchester or Blackpool. Is there a sort of directory somewhere or some website one can go to? He was Sephardic Jewish, originally from Corfu.
Is there anybody who can answer Leslie's question, please?
Died in the 1930s.
Bearing in mind it was Sephardi, so it would be Sephardi cemetery.
Well, there's a Sephardi cemetery in Manchester. And I don't know whether it can be, I don't know whether there's anywhere to search. I mean, I've been there actually. From recollection, it's in Blackhall or somewhere, I can't remember the area, some rather out of the way area. I mean, there is a Spanish-Portuguese community in Manchester to this very day, centered on Didsbury. And in the old days, there was a Spanish-Portuguese shul, beautiful shul in Cheetham Hill. And that is now the home of the Manchester Jewish Museum, recently refurbished and reopened. As to where to find the burial place of an ancestor, well, really, I suppose you just go on Ancestry. That will tell, and get the death certificate. I mean, a good starting point is to know where they died. I mean, the likelihood is, although it's not inevitable, that they will have been buried where they died, albeit I suppose it's possible that if they were from Manchester but died in Blackpool, they may have been transported back to Manchester for burial.
Yes. Thank you.
You mentioned the Manchester Jewish Museum. Perhaps that would be a good place to start, Leslie.
Right, I'll have a go at that. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. We have a comment from John Cowell, a very, very nice complimentary comment about your talk, David.
I'm always happy to hear those.
Yeah, which is very nice to hear. John, do you want to say this yourself? John Cowell? How enjoyable the talk was? Right, okay.
I'm not getting the best of this because John is muted.
John, can you possibly unmute yourself, please?
Thanks. Yes. The other thing I wanted to say was that Manchester Jewish Cemetery is at Urmston, but there is a website. There is more than one website online, I think, to search for Jewish burials in Manchester.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And the talk has been superb example of how to do this kind of talk, I think.
Thank you very much, John. That's very nice. You always worry that you're going to bore people to death, because there's nothing worse than a genealogy bore. We all love the stories of our own families, and that's only natural. But I think there's also a tendency to think that the story of your family is going to be interesting to somebody else, and it isn't always. So thank you. I'm glad that people found my story interesting. I think there are aspects of it which are of general application, as it were. The excitement of it all, late nights, the eureka moments, finding out that you're not exactly who you thought you were. These are things which I think everybody can relate to.
I think Hazel, if you unmute yourself, would you like to also, you've got a complimentary comment to make to to our speaker.
Well, first of all, I'd like to make a comment to Leslie, which is to suggest your old favourite, Doreen, of the Jewish Chronicle archives. And second, yes, I found it a really interesting story and so well told. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel.
Thank you, Hazel, for that comment. Raymond Montangi has got a comment to say. Raymond, can you unmute yourself as well?
Yes, Doreen. As we're north of Watford for the most of the talk, bringing Sheffield into the conversation or inquiry. Our cousin married into a Sarah Vera Perlman. I'm just wondering if you have any connections to Sheffield, David.
I don't have any family connections that I know about. I work there from time to time, and I pass by what was the shul in the synagogue in central Sheffield, which I always find very interesting. They still have, as it were, the 10 Commandments in stone on the outside, even though it's an office building now. The community still exists in Sheffield. It's moved out to the suburbs. But as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I may be wrong. I've been wrong before about which towns I'm connected to. But as far as I know, I don't know of any Sheffield connection between my family. I don't know of any connection between my family and Sheffield. But as my talk illustrated, we move around. Yeah. You know. I mean, that's just the thing, isn't it?
I wonder if John, perhaps John.
You go where the jobs are. You go where you can make a living. That's what it's about ultimately. Where you can bring up your family in decent circumstances. And as economic conditions change, whether it's between one country and another or one city and another, you pack your bags and you go. I'm not sure we do that anymore, but our ancestors did, and they were very brave, if you ask me. Very brave.
Oh, thanks. What about you, John? You're north of Watford as well. Any Sheffield connection, John Perlman?
I don't think so, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was.
Okay.
I've got London in my immediate sort of direct ancestry. I've got London, Leeds, Manchester, and Liverpool.
Oh wow. Okay.
So, quite a lot of Jewish people in Sheffield involved in the cutlery trade, not surprisingly. And in jewellery as well. That's my impression.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Errol, I think, had a comment to make that will be helpful. Errol, can you unmute? Is Errol there?
Yes, hi, I'm here.
Yeah. You had a comment to make about an answer about the burials of Manchester?
Yeah, there were two things. The Manchester and District Council of Synagogues has got a burial database. I've put the link into the chat. I don't think it's got anything up.
Thank you.
That's one way of trying to find it. The other thing I mentioned was that during David's talk, he showed a copy of the census with family living in Lehman Street in London.
Yeah. And
I just noted that the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter was also in.
Yeah.
I don't know the number because you showed number 50, and I don't. It's because it was a multi-occupancy place. Yeah. I just wondered if that's what it was.
Yeah, I also wondered that at one stage. I'm just not sure. It's possible that's where they were living, as it were. Having said that, I mean, that was a temporary shelter, and by 1871, I think my family must have been in England for a good 10 years. Well, they'd been in England for a good 10 years at least. So I'd like to think that they weren't in a temporary shelter. So I don't know, but it's quite a long street, and there were a lot of tenement buildings there. So I mean, they could have been in the shelter. Certainly, it was some kind of dwelling in multi-occupancy. There seemed to be at least 50 people living at the one number, 50 Lehman Street.
Yeah, I can't find the number on a quick search on Google, but
yeah,
you might have to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Very helpful. I'd like to go now to Susan May. If you can unmute yourself. I think you also made a very nice comment about this talk. Susan, unmute.
How?
Hi.
Hi, yes, it's quite inspiring, very well organized and very inspiring. I happen to have English relatives from Stroud, but of course I'm interested in my Jewish relatives too. But very inspiring, especially the Dutch connection. I'm interested in that. I might speak with you offline about how to find that information.
By all means. As I said in my talk, the municipal archives in Amsterdam are pretty much intact. So I found a very big contrast between trying to research my Lithuanian ancestry and, the records are partial at the best. And the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch part of my family, Amsterdam, the archives are complete. So you've got very good records of births, marriages, and deaths still available. And research is very much possible. Yeah, no, as I said in my talk, the Nazis were very anxious to kill all the Jews, but they were very respectful of the paper archives in the way that people can be.
Thank you for that. Thank you,
Doreen.
Yes.
Just to let you know, there's a couple of electronic hands up. Susie Folks and Bernard again.
Okay, can we come back to that, if that's all right with you, because Louise Mason has mentioned something about Sheffield here. Louise, can we unmute if we're not?
Just that my Rosenhead family were kosher butchers in Sheffield, and over the last, and please everybody don't give up with your research, because in connection with this Rosenhead family from Sheffield, 10 years ago I got a message through Jewish Gen, and now in 2021 they came back to me because they'd done DNA tests and they match by DNA, so never give up.
Yeah, because sometimes interesting things come out of our talks. One of the Rosenheads used to live next door to me in Stanmore. I don't know if you would know.
Stephen.
Yes, and his sister Rosalind.
Stephen and Rosalind, yeah. Yes,
Rosalind was my next door neighbour for a while, quite a long time in Stanmore. Just thought I'd mention it. I'm sorry, so I can't see the hands. So Lee, could you deal with this part of it? Because I cannot see the hands.
Yeah, I think Susie had a hand up. Do you still have a comment?
I did. I've just put it in the chat, actually. I just said Cemetery Scribes has details. This is for Leslie, of 10 Greater Manchester cemeteries. That's all.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know how much detail, obviously, they've done on each one, but they've got 10 listed there.
Okay. Hopefully Leslie heard that. She seemed to wander away from her square, but okay, thank you. And
I missed it. I'm sorry.
It's in the chat. So basically, you can take a look at the Cemetery Scribes website as well.
Thank you very much. I have to go, but thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Leslie. And next question, I think, is from Bernard. If you could unmute.
Yeah. It's actually two comments. One is on the Sephardic side, we can go back further because the Portuguese kept very detailed Inquisition records, and there's an amazing amount of information about our families in those. There is also in Spain, but it's not yet as accessible. And the other thing is you posed a kind of rhetorical question about who's interested in all this stuff. And, if it's just, is my family interesting to other people? I wanted to share this with you. In 1979 to 81, I worked for a woman called Barbara Castle, who at that time was a member of the European Parliament, but until her retirement from the UK Parliament had been member for Blackburn. And she was approached by a Europe-wide organization seeking support for conscientious objectors. And we were discussing this, and there was a Portuguese member of parliament with the name Ribeiro. I doubt that they were related, but now I wouldn't doubt anything. And what was interesting is that in a meeting on conscientious objectors in general, Barbara referred to a predecessor of hers as MP for Blackburn, having supported, and I remember the surname as being Ribeiro because we had a Portuguese member of parliament there with the same name. I had forgotten, and I don't know if she said Emmanuel, but it means I was interested at that point. I didn't know anything about genealogy, certainly had no inkling that this person might be related to me, as you have now shown that he was. But these bits of information go out, we pick them up, and years later they come back to bite us, often in very interesting ways. So you may not think it's interesting to other people, but it will turn out to be somewhere along the line.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I think Susie Fawkes, you have a comment to make?
It was just that it was just my message to Leslie about try looking in Cemetery Scribes, which has got 10 cemeteries for Greater Manchester. That was all.
Thank you very much.
And it was a fantastic talk. Thank you, David. Really, really interesting, and you delivered it extremely well. Thank you very much.
Okay. Lee, is there anyone else with their hands up, which I can't see?
Me.
Lee, is there anyone else?
Yeah,
with...
me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just interested in the problem you had on the census with Ribeiro and Lachen and Live Bay, and I was I've had similar problems in my own research, but I was just wondering if there was actually some, connection with those families and some reason for why it was written down, because just mentally I can't quite mispronounce it enough to get there. And then I did a search of Adolf Cohen in the Polish records, and something came up in Prussia. Yeah. And I can't quite understand why it's got anything to do with Adolf Cohen, but it says Adolf Lachman, which seemed to match your Ribeiro confusion, but it could be completely unrelated. But I just so yeah, I don't know if you've tried JRI Poland, but it does cover a little bit of the Prussian records, and it's certainly worth a try because it's free for a start, and you can just do a search there.
Thank you for that, Lee. That sounds like it might be a lead that's worth following. I think we have to, we've all had this. The enumerators who went around the various houses, particularly when they came across immigrants who barely spoke English, they just wanted to get on to the next house. They didn't, very often some of them had beautiful handwriting and were obviously very careful what they wrote. Others, it's perfectly obvious, just wrote whatever they heard. And, these immigrants probably had very poor English. I was told by somebody who was Portuguese, I said, look, you're Portuguese. How am I supposed to actually really pronounce this name? I'm pronouncing it Nunes Ribeiro. I'm sure that's not the proper way. She said, Nunes Ribeiro. So a lot of guttural sounds there. Now, you're an enumerator, you're semi-literate, you're getting paid pennies. You have to go around all these immigrants in the East End of London. Somebody says Ribeiro. You just write down anything that comes into your head. And you don't even care. You don't even care if you put one surname down for the mother, father, and eldest daughter, and put another surname down, Live Bay, for all the other siblings. It makes no sense. And I think we're wasting our time trying to make sense of it. This is human frailty.
Yes, thank you very much, David. Are there any more questions, please? Lee, has anybody got their hand up?
Nope. I don't see any other hands.
If there are any more questions, can you please speak now? Okay, so I'd like to thank David once again for his wonderful talk, which you can see by the amount of interest and questions. It went down very well. So we are going to stop now for a cup of tea, and we're going to come back in 15 minutes so that we can discuss any questions, any problems, any successes that our members have had. I'd like to welcome any transatlantic members. I think there's at least one, maybe two here. So we're very, very pleased to have you, and please stay on. And if we stop for now and come back in 15 minutes, will that be okay with everybody?
Yep.
Thank you. So I'll see you again soon, and a big, big hand for David and his book.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
David, please, you're very welcome to stay on as well. So don't think you're